This is Season 2 of the MENA Talks podcast. The MENA Talks is a series by the BIC on the wider Middle East and Africa regions. Once a month, our hosts, along with special guests, will have a frank discussion on underlying historical, economic, social, and political drivers behind today's systemic issues. The BIC is present on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Follow us and subscribe to receive our latest news and publications.
Welcome, everyone. This is Cinzia Bianco. I'm a senior fellow working on relations between the Gulf and Europe at Brussels International Center, and I'm delighted to be here today with Dubai Abulhoul. Dubai is the founder and CEO of the UAE-based think tank Fiker Institute, and she sits on the COP28 Official Advisory Committee. As a published author, Dubai was named Young Arab of the Year at the first Young Arab Awards for her contributions to culture, literature, and advocacy. She graduated from the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar in Diplomacy and Global Governance, and from New York University, Abu Dhabi, in Political Science and Literature. Welcome, Dubai. We're really grateful to have you here, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, first of all, for your very kind introduction. It's an honor to be here, and I've been greatly looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. So, yeah, I mean, we have also been looking forward to that because we have something really important to discuss. COP28 is about to begin in the UAE, in Dubai. It will start on November 30th and go on until the 12th of December, with a lot of events. In the first phase, the UAE presidency has decided to give a lot of space to different actors from civil society, from organizations from around the world, and discuss a lot of themes before the actual political negotiations, which will happen over the last 2 days. And of course, a lot has already been happening throughout the year towards COP28. The presidency has been very active internationally, engaging with all other governments and representatives from different international institutions. This COP happens at a time where we are facing simultaneously an energy crisis as well as the acceleration of the climate crisis. So definitely a very momentous event. And I think, I'm guessing as well, in the UAE, there's been a lot of events and conversations going on. Can you tell us a little bit about how the UAE and specifically Dubai is gearing up to host COP28, and what is the mood?
The mood is really great, actually, and I think even while COP28 has been months in the making, I think over the past few years in specific, you can feel quite a significant societal shift in the region when it comes to climate awareness, climate advocacy, and I think more importantly, climate inclusion. I think for too long we have seen the Middle East being on the receiving end of a lecture when it comes to global climate policy and global climate debates. And what the mood currently is or signals towards is, now is the chance for the region to showcase its own solutions on climate and to really drive forward a very context driven and context focused sustainability agenda. If you look at particularly Gulf countries, we have been dealing with extreme heat and quite challenging weather conditions for decades, and you see quite a lot of local solutions that have popped up in terms of adaptation, but these local solutions rarely make it to mainstream global coverage on the region, and it's always painted in a very doom and gloom, black and white framing, which has been quite unfortunate, to be honest. Particularly what I'm most excited about with this COP28 presidency is quite a real emphasis on inclusion, and inclusion not just as a talking point, but as an actual process. You see themes like the inclusion of women and indigenous knowledge and community not delegated as side events. They're actually, for the first time, being placed as part of the core agenda and part of the COP28 presidency's actual action plan. So as an observer of quite a number of COPs over the years, I've always asked myself, why is it taking the world 26 COPs, 27 COPs, 28 COPs, 29 and 30, so on? And the only rational reason behind it is to kind of highlight how big of a challenge it really is. And the fact that we are on COP28 with still significant challenges facing global climate policy is worth reflecting on. And if it was a sort of one-size-fits-all challenge, we wouldn't even need to reach COP28. So I think there's quite a lot of nuance that I would like to see going forward, both on the road to COP28, but also in the COPs following that as well.
Definitely, the inclusion point is quite a big one, and I'm sure that this will come up quite predominantly also during the COP, because of a series of events that are also happening in the lead up to the last 2 days of political negotiations, and already before. For example, your institute, the Fiker Institute, has co-hosted with the Museum of the Future in Dubai an event called the Climate Future Week, which I found very interesting. Also, the title of this event, the Climate Future. I mean, knowing a little bit about Emirati culture, I know it's a very future-oriented culture and society, and so I think I appreciate the fact that it's always forward-looking. But I'm very much interested in asking you what has been sort of the outcome of that event, or sort of the key points that emerged in the conversation.
No, thank you very much. We hosted it, just a few weeks ago, and to our surprise, the way it has been received positively has also been quite encouraging. What we wanted to do with the Museum of the Future, who we've partnered with for Climate Future Week, is to really ask a very core question, which is, yes, COP28 is coming up, and it's a very sort of it's a process led by the UNFCCC, and it's very negotiations focused, it's very government focused. How can we bring in other sectors and other parts of society into this conversation in a meaningful way? And when you talk about climate action and mainstream policy debates, you think of negotiators, you think of diplomats, ambassadors, etc. But there's quite a sizable chunk of society that is left out. And we wanted to create a future week that brings in unconventional sectors to the climate conversation. So we brought in filmmakers, artists, creatives. We've launched urban designers. We've launched, on the sidelines of Climate Future Week at the museum, the region's first climate film festival, which showcased different films using storytelling and using fiction to inspire change and to advocate for different climate-related issues, including on a very underrepresented issue of climate refugees. And sort of asking the question, how can we bring in the arts into this conversation? And, how do you inspire the next painter to be involved in climate, as opposed to frame climate as a policy-only exclusive sector that is only reserved for diplomats and government officials? And we've also had quite a big turnout from high schools across the country, and you see quite an encouraging and positive willingness to be part of change, to be part of solutions, and it felt very rewarding to kind of give that platform to parts of society and parts of the region who thought climate, is too intimidating to be involved in. And one particular outcome that I'm very proud of Climate Future Week is the Climate Startup Majlis that we launched, which brought together 7 to 8 founders in the region whose SMEs and small businesses have focused on actual climate solutions. One of those companies is called Carbon Safir, and it's run by a Turkish founder living here in the UAE. And what they do is they're basically bringing the mindset of calculating emissions to companies and doing actual on the ground, company to company, entity to entity change that is unfortunately not covered or given enough amplification, and it's sort of creating that platform is something that we'll continue to work on with the museum on. But also we wanted to, given how big the private sector is in Dubai and the UAE, it was quite interesting to see, how willing they are to actually be part of these solutions over the course of the week.
I mean, that's really fascinating. I find the idea of bringing in creative arts really interesting. I want to ask you a quick follow-up on that. Do you think that this is a very Dubai thing because Dubai is traditionally at the forefront of creative industry in the wider region? Or did you have the chance to also engage people working in the creative industry in other countries of the Middle East and North Africa region?
Yes, so the week actually opened up fully to a more Middle Eastern audience as well. So while there was significant representation from the UAE side, there were also artists who have moved to the UAE, architects who have moved to Dubai that we've included in this conversation as well. And I think when you think of climate, unfortunately, because of how it's covered in mainstream global media, you could think at the top of your head, if you're not an expert in the field, on 2 to 3 themes. So naturally, that framing and that emphasis on only 2 to 3 factors of climate policy has led to the sense of, this sector is reserved only to specific types of jobs or types of segments in society. And what we wanted to do is to kind of break that very binary, I would say, a framing of climate action. And when you bring creativity and you pull in innovation, particularly from the private sector, which is extremely efficient, when you bring that mentality into influencing actual government policy and putting an architect in the same room as an ambassador, the same room as a minister, the same room as a filmmaker, quite a lot of magic happens. And I think the different participants start out maybe a bit intimidated, I would assume, but we were very surprised by the outcomes of the sessions, and they're all publicly available on the museum's YouTube channel, actually. So I highly encourage people to see these conversations and how they unfolded.
Yeah, sounds something that definitely deserves more attention. I want to stay on the theme of sort of unexpected or sort of unexplored connections and ask you about the idea that I think is gaining a lot of prominent space at COP28 specifically, of giving more space to the connection between climate and health.
Yes.
There's been already a number of studies that have proven, of course, that, climate change in many ways can affect negatively health, and that countries that are subjected to more climate catastrophes or pollution, they register more people sort of falling ill because of it. But I would argue that there hasn't been enough of a conversation on that. And I was wondering, what is your perspective?
I think it's both good and bad at the same time. Good that we're finally talking about it in a serious way, and bad that it has taken us this long internationally to make that link, because to me the two are quite inseparable. We definitely do need a bigger emphasis of climate adaptation in the health sector, but also I think equally understudied or underfocused on is the role of climate education in the health sector. The concept of climate should not be something that we plug into different sectors and call it a day. There needs to be a real integration of climate education into health, and whether that takes the form of different executive trainings or reskilling the health sector. I think we can't afford this conversation being sidelined and something that we perhaps announce things on without follow-up on actual implementation on the ground. And I think this is where we will definitely have to count on the footprint actually of the private sector and the kind of finance that would pull in as well. We need to make sure climate finance is significantly portioned towards the climate and health nexus. And I think making sure it's part of the integral main agenda as opposed to a side event is going to be key. And how does that look on the ground is something I'm also curious to see unfold during COP28 and beyond. But it's definitely commendable that it is a link that I have also, just as a think tank, observed the UAE's presidency put quite a big focus on in the past few months.
But you also mentioned already sort of one of the two big beasts of this conversation being climate finance, and the other one being sort of the global stocktake, basically countries participating to COP, looking at what they have achieved, what they have not achieved, and what are sort of credible but ambitious new targets for the future. These two files are really expected to be some of the most complicated files at the political level because of existing sort of disagreements. But I want to go first to sort of unpack what is the status of the different parties and positions on these big issues and others. But then also in the second part of this question, I want to highlight some instead space for convergence that I have seen coming up over the past 2 months, I would say, and then sort of pose it to you. So let's start first with sort of the status of the conversation. You sit on the COP28 Advisory Committee, which is a really international group. Is there anything that you can share with us and with the listeners on the sort of conversations that you guys have been having in the committee?
So all of the conversations have, unfortunately to this podcast, have been off record, but I can share a few things I have learned from my time so far on the committee, and something that I saw was unexpected, which is the COP28 president deliberately putting together quite diverse and different perspectives in the committee. So you can see the different members sit on quite different ends of the climate debate. But I think that is actually what has pulled it all together. And in many ways, these meetings have represented at a very smaller scale a lot of differing and maybe at sometimes, as you said, diverging opinions on some of these biggest themes that all COPs, not just COP28, have been trying to reach consensus on. It's been quite an interesting exercise as well to see, how do you bring together all of these perspectives? And to the COP28 president's credit, I think the diversity itself has sharpened a lot of our own assessments coming into that advisory board. And now maybe as we progress towards, as COP is going to start and the end of this, you can see quite, and I can speak only on behalf of myself, I can see quite a difference on how easy I thought it would be to tackle some of these challenges when we first started the committee, and where we are today. And I think, that's not necessarily a bad thing. The complexity of negotiations, and mind you, the committee itself, the advisory committee, is around 25 to 30 people. So can you imagine trying to get consensus of the entire international community on some of these issues? I think a lot of nuance when it comes to covering different COPs and not just COP28 is lost. And I don't think there's quite enough realization that it is a negotiation process, and a negotiation process means you need to get consensus of everyone, and to do that is quite an impossible task. But I think progress on it has to be incremental. Otherwise, it would be a case of one region forcing its own perception of what should happen on a specific file on another, and you're just simply going to be stuck in a policy cycle where no side benefits from. So I think having to remind myself as well that the COP process itself is a negotiation. It's something I always try to tell myself whenever I feel frustrated on some of these policy issues. And ultimately, it is in the hands of the participating parties. COP presidencies have the ability, as well as I would argue the responsibility, to advance a lot of the consensus on some of these topics, but no COP presidency can force its own desired outcomes on the negotiators. And I think not enough angles from a negotiating perspective is covered or discussed in the mainstream.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there are, big challenges that, and consensus, arriving at consensus is going to be a tough one. But I also want to raise some points of convergence and unity as well, because amid all the complexities and difficulties, I think there has been a lot of work, including, behind the scenes, to get to before the beginning of COP with some sort of common ground to stand on. And for example, I was positively impressed by a notepad, a public letter, open letter signed by the COP28 President, Dr. Sultan Al Jaber, as well as the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, the President of Kenya, the Prime Minister of Barbados, and the directors of the International Energy Agency and the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA. And in that sort of joint OPAD, they signed off on quite ambitious targets, including, tripling the capacity for renewable energy globally, doubling the targets for energy efficiency and the production of hydrogen by 2030. And these are things that obviously it's quite a vague commitment, because they are not talking about an action plan to implement these targets, but already is, I think, ambitious targets that are, however, credible. And it's a show of unity of leaders coming from very different regions and in different international institutions. I mean, do you think that on some of these points, that sort of letter, open public commitment, means that compromise is within reach?
I hope so, genuinely. And I would be wary of sort of myself making early predictions too early. We're still a month ahead of COP, but I think, even those on opposing sides of this debate, they're not here to oppose for the sake of opposition. There are quite a lot of significant realities on the ground that differ between contexts that force these kind of diverging positions to take place. So I think there are, yes, a lot of overarching themes that are easier to get consensus on. How things play out in reality is quite, I think, a different story for each region, as well as each country involved in the negotiation process. I think what needs to happen more is quite a lot of trust needs to be built between both global north and global south. And in this discussion, there needs to, you kind of see that gap increasing, that gap of misunderstanding increasing. And that's something that I feel like is unfortunate if we don't all actually come together, not just for COP28, but also beyond, because what we're dealing with is genuinely a borderless issue. When you have a natural disaster or an outbreak or an earthquake, it impacts everyone. And countries can no longer afford to look at it as sort of like, I will deal with climate this way versus another. It is a borderless issue. But I think we also can't completely ignore historical context when it comes to this debate and this conversation. Countries and populations that have contributed far less to man-made climate action are often the ones who suffer the most from its consequences. And, it's very easy for us to all just come out one day and say, yes, we want to completely shut down the energy system and start renewables tomorrow. But not every country has that privilege, and not every country can afford to do that sort of switch off and call it a day. And I think there's quite a lot of resentment actually from countries who feel like their natural resources have been exploited historically to fund the development of developed countries, and now an energy transition is not something that is taken as seriously as it should be. Every country has their right to development. Every country has a right to see how to best fund and enable their own development and basics of development as well. So it can't be a blanket solution, I would say, that fits everyone at the same time.
Yeah, I think sort of in a, if you allow me, sort of a diplomatic way, you have addressed one of the most contentious issues. But I have to say, you know, from a European perspective, there has been a lot of soul searching on this topic. These messages that you have just shared with us have been shared already, obviously, you know, and I think to a certain extent, they have been absorbed. Just very recently, less than 2 weeks ago, the European Union has shared its own official negotiating position. And it took them some time because they wanted to reach a more credible and pragmatic compromise, which I think goes very much in the direction you were outlining. And this is quite new from a European perspective. But I think there has been some sort of soul searching and a realization that we are facing two crises, not just one being climate security, but the other one being energy security. And so my expectation, since very recently, since this new position has been agreed upon, is on a bit of a more pragmatic and sort of open negotiating position for Europe towards other perspectives and sort of greater willingness to meet others in the middle and reach a compromise that is constructive, ambitious, but also credible. I mean, again, this might be my own assessment of that work that has been done. But let me ask then sort of your perspective on this. In particular, what would you like Europeans to know and to keep in their mind as they get to COP?
It's a tough question. I can sort of share what I have at the top of my head, I guess. But what we would greatly benefit from is letting go of a one-way lecture approach to climate policy, and letting go of the stubbornness surrounding the idea that there is only one way, or quite few ways that equate to effective climate action. The lack of enough context when it comes to a lot of the policy recommendations we see coming out of Europe to the rest of the world ignore quite a lot of awkward questions like, okay, you know, this sounds like a great plan. Who's going to fund it? Where are we going to get funding from? So I think focusing on, while it's important to sort of have like blanket terms, like by X year, we want to do this. I think what people are most concerned with is what are we going to do tomorrow and next week and the week after that? And how can we move towards climate policy that actually is based in equitable, multilateral mentality, you know, versus we took one solution that has worked in one part of the world and we're just exporting it to everyone else. I think that the ability to keep an open mind and to consider that different regions will require very different climate solutions and very different phases of their development is a mentality that would avoid having us clash over one thing that completely stalls progress on 99 other things as well. And I think I'm yet to see that taking place effectively. I think the things we disagree on are by far much less than those that we do agree on as different regions. And what I don't want to see is sort of in the coming weeks finding ourselves stuck on one or two themes and completely ignoring everything else we could be working on, which I understand sometimes comes along with sensationalist coverage of COPs everywhere around the world. But it's quite a missed opportunity to not have it be a solution-focused agenda, not just during COP, but also beyond that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think because you've basically touched upon that, a short follow-up on sensationalism in media, which we have seen, as you mentioned, with all COPs, and this one is no exception. Do you expect, in terms of not just the media coverage of COP, but also sort of the activism that is around environmental causes? Do you expect that to be more than other COPs, just the same, different? And if yes, in what way? I mean, what are your sort of expectations on that topic?
Mm-hmm. So both the UAE's COP28 presidency as well as the UNFCCC came out with a joint statement on this recently, actually, and announced that there will be a dedicated space for climate advocates to assemble peacefully. I think my take on the role of climate activism on this is of course my own. It's not representative of neither the advisory group nor the UAE's presidency. But I can tell you that I've been very intently observing what different activists and NGOs around the world have been advocating for. Again, not just in this COP, but in different COPs. And I think there's quite the difference between advocacy and actual policy implementation. So when it comes to policy advocacy, there's quite a lot that we all want to see happen, not just in climate, but also even with the little nuances that govern COP debates. But it's different when you come and ask an activist, okay, how do we implement this recommendation today? And quite often you would find that conversation, frankly, not going anywhere. And this is why I sort of try to see, okay, how do we get the perspective of global advocacy when it comes to climate change and actually translate it into real policy that can be implemented next week, versus have a lot of advocacy that is unfortunately sometimes conflated with virtue signaling, with double standards, with criticism for the sake of criticism, versus actually wanting to implement real change on climate, not just in the region but also beyond. So there's definitely going to be space for advocacy, I imagine, but I think what we would need support on, even as different think tanks here based in the UAE, is how do we take those advocacy themes and help support translating them into real policy, as opposed to end the conversation when COP28 is over? How do we actually turn it into something that is tangible, something that is action oriented?
Yeah, I mean, that's always the challenge, right? Bridging the gap between advocacy and policy.
Mm-hmm.
And so just my final question mm-hmm. Is there, it's very early to talk about that, but can you imagine what would be the legacy of mm-hmm. COP28 on the UAE, the Gulf, or the wider MENA region?
I think it's a question I also find myself going back to, and maybe I should also have a follow-up to that question after COP, but I think maybe then I'll have a more satisfying answer. But I think for now, what my feeling is, what the UAE's legacy is bringing to the COP process itself is an actual blueprint of inclusivity. And not inclusivity as a talking point, not inclusivity as something that we do as a side activation, but how climate action can actually be driven when inclusivity is at the core of its agenda. And when we talk about inclusivity, it's not just the case of making sure we have women involved and youth and indigenous groups, but it's also the unconventional players in this discussion, which have often been left out of this conversation, which are oil and gas companies. How do we bring them in to make sure they have commitments that actually support climate action, versus lock them out and continue to work in silos? How do we, when we bring everyone together, it means those that we may have a hard time wanting to talk to or to negotiate with. But how else are you going to find a solution if you don't talk with the same sector, but everyone has been pointing their fingers at? How do we bring them in and actually through the process even hold them accountable? You can't do that unless they're included in the process. And so we're yet to see how a lot of these inclusive dynamics will take shape during COP28 and beyond. But what I would like to see is a round of COP that actually focuses on solutions instead of blaming different sectors or different entities or different regions actually entirely for the borderless issue of climate change that we are all significantly and severely impacted from.
Yeah, thank you, Dubai. Thank you. That was a fascinating conversation. I think we've covered a lot of ground. We talked about how to bridge the gap between a policy conversation and then other sectors such as the creative industry, the link to other themes such as health, inclusivity of, not just civil society, women, indigenous groups, and youth, but also of sort of private sector, including private sector that gets a lot of blame for climate change, and then how many different perspectives there are internationally, and what that sort of means for a difficult conversation at COP28, but also ambitious objectives. I think it was the second consecutive COP in the wider Middle East and North Africa region. And if you allow me, I see a difference already between the one in Egypt and the one in the UAE in terms of also bringing up perspectives from the region into the global conversation on climate. And I am really glad that we got to do this, because this is one more that is going to be shared with the wider audience. And I think it will be very much useful for inclusivity in the conversation ahead of the event.
Thank you so much, and I'm very excited to see how our predictions fare up after COP28 and to revisit this conversation then. And thank you very much for giving me this platform, and I look forward to also continuing our conversations offline as well.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the MENA Talks. Share your thoughts with us on social media with the hashtag MENA Talks, and follow us to receive our latest news and updates. The MENA Talks is a podcast series on the Middle East and Africa, an initiative of the Brussels International Centre.